Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah. I'm calling in from New Hampshire today, the original lands of the Abenaki and Pennacook people. I'm calling from Morning Sun Mindfulness Center. It's a beautiful, warm day. I hope all of you are doing well. I will read an introduction about our dear facilitator today. Please enjoy your breathing together as we settle in. We're really fortunate to have today's Sangha held by Chaya Ocampo Go. Her pronouns are she and her. She is a Filipina scholar activist committed to well-being and survival in marginalized communities across the Philippines. She served as an emergency relief worker at the wake of Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. She is currently a Ph.D. student of critical disaster studies at York University. She lives with her husband in Toronto, the traditional homelands of the Anishinabek Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Great love and hope inspires her continued work among front lines of various disaster events in the Philippines. Her doctoral research features 3 short films on women leading grassroots disaster response efforts in the country, one of which we will see today. Chaya was ordained as a member of the OI in 2019 with the name True Radiant Cloud. And the topic for today, just a brief introduction before she'll share more. Our theme is climate change and the dangers of a single story. What stories do we hear and tell about climate change? What dangers arise when we reduce the complexity of human beings' multiple and vast experiences of the climate crisis into single narratives? Please join one of our new Caretaking Council members, Chaya Go, in a brief presentation inspired by the talk of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie on the danger of a single story, to reflect on the individual and collective stories that we tell. Drawing insights from her own personal spiritual practice and her research on community-based disaster responses in the Philippines, Chaya's presentation hopes to enrich our understanding of the many true names of earth justice. Thank you, dear friends, for being here. I'll bow out, and Chaya, feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Hello, dear Thai, dear Sangha. Good morning from Toronto. Is my audio okay? If I get a thumbs up, my mic is working all right? Great. Thank you. First of all, blessings to all. Happy New Year to everyone. It's such a joy to be starting this year with all of you. Thank you for being here. I realize I'm here because each and every one of you are here on the call with me, and I'm very humbled and grateful to be able to share some of my work here on Sangha. It's my first time doing this outside of, the workspaces of outside the university and in a spiritual community. So I'm truly, truly humbled and very happy. Thank you, Sarah, for starting our time today, and I know that I'm here with my siblings from the Caretaking Council too, so I'm happy to have their support. I'd like to begin our time today with just a very short meditation. So I know some of you may know Thai's poem, Please Call Me By My True Names. There's a beautiful piece of music that goes with the song, and I would just like to play the song for us before I start speaking. So I'll invite one sound of the bell to invite everyone to take a moment to connect with our bodies, to feel our seat, feel the contact we're making with the ground. Feel the rise and fall of our tummies with our breath. Just gently inviting our minds to come back, to come home to our bodies. Thank you, dear Sangha. I hope you enjoyed that. So I'll be beginning my presentation now. I'll have about 15 minutes to share a few stories, share some thoughts about the theme of our time together today. And I'll be spending the last 10 minutes of my presentation sharing a short video with everyone. So that's a treat too, and I hope everybody enjoys that. So the title of our time together today is Climate Change and the Dangers of a Single Story. And some of you may know the inspiration behind the title. So it's borrowing from a TED Talk, a very popular one that was given by, I see some of you smiling there, so maybe you know her, but it was given by a Nigerian-born novelist, and her name is Chimamanda Adichie. And it's a very popular talk that she gave about 10 years ago now, so this was in 2009. And I first heard this video when I was a young student who flew from Manila as an international student and arrived in Vancouver for university. And I was very young, and I was very deeply curious about the world, and in turn very curious about to learn about my place in the world and who I was in this bigger story. And her talk was one of the, I think until today, was one of like the biggest teachers for me, a very inspirational one. And without giving away too much of the talk, if you haven't heard her, please listen to her TED talk after this. But she begins her talk by sharing what it was like as to be a little girl in Nigeria, who was a very avid reader and read so much, and she read tons of British literature, British storybooks for kids. And she was saying that these stories are often, had characters that played in the snow, who ate apples and talked about the weather and so on. And she sort of consumed that as a very curious young girl. And in turn, she started writing her own stories, but she was replaying, was basically just sort of repeating everything that she had read. And so her characters were very similar to what she was reading. And of course, on the surface, it seemed sort of just as kind of like cute, sort of harmless kind of entertainment, right? But as she grew up, she shared that she realized that actually these stories had a profound effect on her view of the world, and she had grown up thinking that people who looked like her, who lived lives like hers, could not be characters in stories or in literature. And so that began her passion for African literature and for writing a lot and telling her own stories through her novels later on in life. And so she, by listening to this talk, it makes us think about really the power of stories and the power that lies in who gets to tell what kinds of stories, about who and about what. And that when if a particular story, she calls this a single story, right? If a particular story gets repeated over and over again, by a person, by a group of people, about another person or another group of people, or a place, it begins to hold a kind of authority, right? It becomes and defines the reality for an entire community. And there's a real violence that could be lying very subtly in that practice, because it flattens, right? It reduces the wholeness or the complexity of a living person or of an entire people. And so I was thinking about, through our own, with the Dharma and through our own practice too, and the teachings that Chaya have shared with us, I was thinking about how stories, of course, are not just the ones we read in books, but that they could really be in the level of our thoughts, right? The kinds of scripts, the narratives that get played, like tapes, like loops in our mind, about ourselves or about another person or about an entire community of people, and they begin to define, takes on a kind of power when we keep repeating them unconsciously, mindlessly in our minds. And if we're not careful, of course, this moves into our speech too. The words we use, how we speak about ourselves, how we speak about others. And of course, our speech will then later on, if we're not careful, of course, will also translate into the kinds of actions and behaviors that we engage in. And so there's a real power in stories if we begin to think about them in that way. And of course, they're not just produced in our thoughts and our speech and our actions, but we're also consuming stories every day in many different ways, through our senses, through the news, through the media, what we take in. through movies, songs, popular culture. And if we begin to think about how these things travel, and of course with globalization today, they travel all across the world, and they could either be very empowering, or they could also break an entire community, or it could also inflict real dangers if we're not careful. And so Adichie's talk helps me to realize, or to be ever aware that language, stories that we tell historically and up until today have been used to colonize, right? They've been used to wage wars. They can perpetuate, things like racism and justify violence inflicted on one another, on the earth. It can also keep people in poverty, and it can be a real oppressive force. So I've been living in Canada for the last many years now on unceded First Nations Indigenous territories, and as a Filipina who's here in Canada, I've been really drawn to this sort of very exciting time of real growth and uprising in the climate justice movement that's spreading across, all across the global north. And as someone whose country is, ranked one of the most at risk and most vulnerable to these intensifying weather conditions, I've been invited and drawn to participate in many different ways. I've been asked to speak at marches, to share stories in classrooms, to share about my work in different kinds of gatherings. But as I participate actively in these spaces, I've also, with the help of the practice, I think has really, I've grown a kind of real sensitivity and sort of mindfulness for how single stories can come up and pop up in these movements that many of us are part of. So I've been quite cautious and quite sensitive to them whenever I see them, and I do make a note to continue to reflect on them and maybe even offer a different voice or a different story so that I could help make more complex, more complete some of these narratives that have been gaining a lot of audience. And to make that more concrete, I think I'll share a few with you, some of these questions that I've been thinking about. And this is also in the spirit of Adichie's talk. And so I was thinking lately, what if we in telling stories about climate change and the crisis, so what if we begin the story not with the measurement of carbon levels in the atmosphere, right? Or not with the reports that we're reading by, that's issued by the IPCC or climate scientists. Not to disregard them, and I have complete confidence in the kinds of rigor that these research studies have done. Not to deny them, but what if we sort of tuned our ears, sort of shifted them a little bit to hear different sets of stories, and what if we heard more about or listened more to creation stories that are told by First Nations communities, stories that talk about not of how many, not of how much carbon is in the atmosphere or sort of how many degrees we need to keep it down to, but that talk about responsibilities that are enshrined in covenants or natural laws that for them have existed since the beginning of time. And as a migrant here and a migrant and a settler here on Turtle Island, when I'm invited to listen to these stories, I couldn't help but feel a real shift, a very sort of powerful, like in my body, I could really feel a shift of almost a paradigm shift, right? how to understand this crisis in a different way that would invite me to act also from a different place and from a different kind of understanding. And what if we began the story not with the tar sands and the pipelines, catastrophic as they may be today, but with the dishonoring of treaties that were mutually agreed upon and signed, right, hundreds of years ago, but also continually being dishonored up until today, then climate change would have a very different kind of story to tell. And then, in our protests, in our climate strikes, out in the streets, what if people's chants and placards and signs, right, were, I didn't help but think, but what if they were less about our fears of this apocalyptic future, right, of like this so-called premature death that so many at least in my city or from the news we're seeing are frightful of, but just these very old everyday stories of, for example, of having water advisories on reserves because water couldn't be drank. Water is not drinkable because there's mercury or lead in them. Or that of people living in neighborhoods where they're breathing in fumes from industrial plants and waste management, waste treatment facilities. And some of you we have heard this video, but there was, I think this was in November last year. This was recorded in Plum Village, France. Satish Kumar, who is a peace pilgrim, who had led walks for nuclear disarmament years ago, had done incredible work throughout his life on deep ecology and the economy. When he was interviewed by one of the monastics, senior brothers there, if he had a message for young climate activists who were watching, and what would it be? Satish Kumar said, of course I have a lot of admiration and respect for these young, for the youth, and I, send them a lot of power, and I believe that they have to continue what they're doing with great passion. But when and he's in his 80s now, an elderly man, but he was saying, with this very gentle, wise tone, he was cautious to remind us that let's also not forget, right, that for a very long time now across the world, people have long been dying of wars and poverty and pollution, and these happen on a daily basis in the most mundane ways, in the most unspectacular ways. And as a Filipina, of course, that hit me right, to the core. These are realities that I lived with, growing up, seeing all around me in our society. But also being here in Canada, I was reminded that if we listened more to voices and leadership and stories that are coming out of Black communities, out of Indigenous communities, migrant communities, that we will hear very different kinds of stories about environmental degradation, about survival, about well-being. And they're not, understandably so, they're not going to be about a forthcoming future, some distant future kind of doomsday, but it will be about now, and it will be about the past, and it will be about surviving the everyday. So Sarah shared it briefly when she introduced me earlier in the call, that I had some experience working as a relief worker at the wake of Super Typhoon Haiyan. This was in 2013. Some of you may know that the storm has taken on this infamous title of being the strongest storm ever in the planet's recorded history, and that went through the Philippines 7 years ago now. And of course, given the very high-paced, sort of chaotic nature of that work, we're so busy, of course, giving out rice and medicine and things that were of urgent need. We and I really did not have the time nor the practice. I didn't have the practice then to be present, to listen to the people we were working with or to people we were serving. And it was only later on when I had the privilege of coming back to Canada for graduate school that I had the chance, the time, the space, and the resources to design a research project that would allow me to return to some of these places, to the island of Leyte, one of the many that were hit, so that I could take the time to hear about different kinds of stories, not just of the catastrophic storm surges or the 350-kilometer-per-hour wind speeds, but it was to tune into different kinds of realities, because I was very clear to me that I wanted to understand, and to do that, I also needed to slow down. My mind had to slow down. My heart had to be strong and open enough, and that my body was rested so that I could truly pay attention and be with them and learn from them. So in Adichie's talk, she says that, of course there are stories of catastrophes that need to be told and heard, but it may very well be more important or urgent to hear about stories of people's thriving and surviving in spite of so much violence that's present in their everyday lives. So it was clear to me that just taking the time here, that I didn't want to, thinking about Thai's poem and the song that we heard earlier on, about our many true names. If each of us are not these one-dimensional, static, frozen things, but if we are living, breathing, ever-changing streams of life, if each of us are, what more the communities that we're part of, what more the nations that we're a part of, human and more than human, the ecologies we're part of. We are so much more than our suffering, and to only talk about, say, in my case, to only talk about poverty, or to only talk about being at the front lines of the climate crisis, won't be enough. To some of you who, just to offer some context, if you're not aware, so the Philippines is, in Southeast Asia. It lies east of Vietnam, north of Indonesia, and south of China, and Pacific Ocean is to our east. And so the storms come in right from the ocean every year. We have about 20 on average that come in, and it's a country of over 7,000 islands, and so that just to even think that one story could speak about the entire nation, that could capture everything that's happening in there, and the kinds of things we have to resolve and work through and grapple with and celebrate, that can't possibly be encapsulated in one simple narrative, right? And so it makes the Dharma very clear to me, in a sense, that we are all of this. We are, as Thai says, we are both our pains and our joys. We are, in us live both, the victim and the oppressor, both the mud of, a lot of violence and anger, ignorance, but also a lot of compassion and understanding and the seeds of awakening. And all of that are real, and they're all here. They're all in me, they're all in each of us, and they're also all in the communities I work in. And to write and so as a scholar, when I've been writing chapters the last few months for my program, and I've been trying to be very careful, very, very careful about how I write about these realities. and not to flatten them in any kind of way. And so I will now be transitioning to share one of the 3 videos that my research team and I had the real pleasure and enjoyment of creating for my fieldwork. This was back in 2018. We traveled to 3 different communities, 3 villages, to learn about their practice of community-based disaster management. Just to explain that a little bit, instead of being too dependent, let's say, on the government or on foreign humanitarian workers or the military to come in and assist them every time something happens, this practice or this approach called community-based disaster management basically recognizes that members of these communities, no matter how marginalized, no matter how vulnerable they are, really have the capacity to lead. They have skills, they have talents, they have real care for each other. These communities are often very tightly knit, and that they could lead their own efforts, and they can determine what is important to them and the solutions that they would need to transform these dangers, right, that they live with. So the first community we visited was an urban poor community in Metro Manila. So it's an informal settlement in one of the most densely populated areas in the city. The second one, which we will be watching today, is from a farming community in the northern province of Zambales. And the third one is an island village of fisher folk off the island of Cebu, and they were hit by Haiyan in 2013. And it was interesting visiting them again many years later to see how they were doing. And so while each of these, they're case studies in the academic world, but to me they're really sort of these worlds of their own where one could learn so much from. So while each of these cases talk about different kinds of social and ecological injustices, we also have sometimes even a lot more to say about what it means to be well, what it means to survive, and what they're doing in concrete ways to help each other to do that. And so so the video is about 10 minutes long. It is narrated in Filipino, so I would request for you to, so once I share my screen, if you could make sure it's on in full view on your screen. Subtitles will be in English, will be present on the bottom. And maybe to start off for another sound of the bells, that we could truly be there, truly be there to meet these people in the film, and to truly hear what they have to share, and so that we could also allow our hearts to be open, our minds to be open, so we could receive, and hopefully some insights could arise for each one of us.
Signal number 4 na po ngayon.
Humihingi po ng tulong ang local government sa San Mateo.
Nakataas sa red alert. Diyanig na magnitude 5.9 na rin doon ang hiling na bigas sa mga magsasaka.
Sumiklab na laman ang pakpakang
Pilipinas.
Taon-taon na lang ay saksi tayong mga Pilipino sa mga pinsala at kamatayang dulot ng iba't ibang mga disasters. Ayon sa marami, naging normal na raw ang kahirapang dulot ng mga ito. Ano nga ba ang kahulugan ng disaster? Ito ba ang malalakas na hangin taglay ng isang bagyo? O ang tuluyang pagkasira ng mga kabuhayan at kabahayan ng mga nasalanta? Hindi pantay-pantay ang epekto ng mga disaster sa mga miyembro ng ating lipunan. May mga taong pinaka-vulnerable tulad ng mga mahihirap, ang may sakit, ang matatanda, ang kabataan at kababaihan. Ano ang disaster para sa mga maralitang tagalungsod, sa mga magsasaka at mangingisda? Ano naman ang ginagawa ng mga magiging na community leaders upang unang tumugon sa kanilang mga barangay? Ito po ang kwento ng Barangay Malabago ng Santa Cruz, Zambales.
Bilang isang membro ng aming asosasyon, ako'y isang magsasaka. May sarili kaming taniman. Yung walang sariling tuhunan na magsasaka, ito po'y nangungutang. Pero pag bago ka magtanim ay inutang mo na yung pira, mababa yung presyo. Pero pag naitanim mo na yung palay, mataas yung presyo na pambili sa'yo mamaya.
Ang epekto po ng baha dito sa amin sa Barangay Malabago, tuwing anim po namin nababawasan. Katulad ngayon pong ani ko, dumaan po yung bagyong Ompong, bagyong Rosita. Dati nag-aani po ako ng 200 kaban. Ngayon, 66 kaban ang naani ko. Naging maiksi ang bunga na ang aning palay. Tuwing magsasaka po kami, umuutang kami sa ibang tao. Kung nabagyo po kami dito, halos hindi po kami makabayad ng utang. May nakukuha po kami insurance pag inire-report namin yung palay namin. Pagkatapos ng bagyo, dapat po mag-report kami sa DA para alam po ng DA i-insured yung palay po namin. Ang insurance po ng palay, porsyento lang po ang naibabalik sa amin. Ako, gumagastos ako ng 50,000, 5,000, 3,000 lang po ang nakukuha po namin sa insurance.
Kami po yung nag-i-spray ng mangga kasama ako ng aking asawa. Ako yung nasa baba, nag-aalalay sa makina. Kasi naman ay nasa taas ng mangga na siya ang nagbubumba. Ngayon, ang pag-i-spray namin ng mangga, nag-umpisa sa buwan ng September, hanggang 20 days na siya bago namin i-harvest yun para gustong gulang ang mangga. Tapos naman, minsan, kapag dinaanan po ito ng bagyo, nasisira din. Kami pa naman porsentuhan lang po sa manggahan. Sa 20%, ang porsyento ng mangga, 3 tao pa ang maghahati. Kung ano po yung napagbintahan, doon po kami kumukuha ng porsyento. Anong panahon po ng Kusme, marami pong natumbang mga mangga. Yung iba naman ay nagkaroon pa ng sanga, yung hanggang ngayon, yung pa rin ang in-exprehan. Pero pagdating nitong bagyong Ompong, marami na naman siyang binumba na hindi naman na napakinabangan yung iba naman, buhay din. Lubog sa matataas na baha at nagtataas ang bintang, mahirap ang buhay ng mga magsasakang umaasa sa sakot ulay upang makatanim. Bago pa man din dumating ang mga bagyo, sila'y vulnerable na. Kadalasan, sila'y umaasa na lamang na hindi na pa rin ng bagyo ang kanilang mga abono at ani. Paano kaya pinalalakas ang kakayahan ng mga nasalantang pagsasaka? Kilalanin natin ang Community-Based Disaster Management, isang pagkilos na isinusulong ng Citizens Disaster Response Network. Ang Alay Bayan Luzon Incorporated ay kasalukuyang naghahatid ng programa mula sa ibang part ng Region 1, meron ding ibang bahagi sa part ng Region 2. Kabilang din po sa programa ng AGI yung pagbibigay serbisyo sa buong Region 3. Nagsasagawa muna kami ng training analysis upang sa gayon ay matiyak na pangunahing participants sa pagsasanay ay iyong mga vulnerable sector. Ang kasunod doon, naglulunsad na kami ng 2 araw na pagsasanay, yung Community-Based Disaster Management Training, upang mas maipaliwanag sa mga tao sa komunidad kung ano talaga inyong mga dapat gawin bago, habang at pagkatapos ng disaster. Kami ay nagbubuo ng isang organisasyon at ito yung tinatawag namin Métis.
Itong kulay green ay isang palayan. Ito namang blue ay palisdaan. At ito naman ay alamangan.
Yung panahon ng typhoon Humpong, minamataan na talagang lalandfall po sa Zambales. Kaya ang ginawa po namin bilang DPC, talaga kami kung sinong bahay-bahay, kung sinong nakatoka sa evacuation, at kung sino ang magbibilang ng mga taong na pwede i-rescue po para pumunta po sa evacuation center.
Ang DPC Sama ay nagsimulang maglunsad ng tree planting mangrove. Ang una naming layunin nito ay makapagbigay protection sa seashore ng Malabago. Ang pinaka-the best na tinatanim dito itong bakawan. Kasi ang bakawan ay dagdag kabuhayan din ito. Once na lumaki na sila, nagiging marami na yung nag-scattered na yung mga ugat niya. Doon namamahay ang mga species ng mga isda, saka yung mga alimango, para sa bandang huli, sa mga bagong henerasyon, hindi mawawala yung mga kabuhayan na siyang tinututukan din ng mga taga rito. Kasi ito ang isa rin sa malaking contribute sa kabuhayan ng mga mangingisda. Saka kahit yung hindi sila lumalaot, nakakailaw sila dito.
Yung pangunahin na kahirapan na naranasan ng mga magsasaka, siyempre yung kawalan ng sariling lupa o sinasaka, binabayarang buwis o nakikiupa. At mga manggagawang bukid naman ay yung nawalan sila ng mga sinasakang pwede nilang pagtrabahuan dahil din naman sa pagkakaroon ng mas high-tech na ngayon na equipment o yung harvester.
Ako, na malawak ang kaalaman o naging tulong ng DPC ng AGI, ito ang panghahawakan ko. Maiangat namin ang ginahangad namin bilang namumuno ng mga kababaihan. Bilang isang babae na nagagawa ko pong magsigib ng tubig, o wala po siya kasi kasakulo ko yung po siya nag-i-spray ng mangga, ito talaga ang kanyang hanap buhay. At lahat po ng mga gawain sa aming tahanan ay nagagamparan ko po. Ang nagagawa ko po ngayon, na hindi ko nagagawa noon, ay ang paglibot-libot sa mga barangay, naghahanap ng mga datos kung panahon ng kalamidad. Yung gusto ko po na next ang aming organisasyon, hindi naman po buong Malabago ay nabigyan po ng mga training. Hinahanap po namin na lahat po sila ay mabigyan po ng mga trainings na anuman po ang nakalipas na mga trainings na hindi po
pagkakakitaan po nila kung ano po ang ginagawa namin sa mga aming organisasyon. Kasi po yung trainings naman po na binibigay, yun po ay libre.
Sa pag-organize ng ABI sa DPC ay nandito yung tuloy-tuloy na programa at paano palakasin ang organization at kilalanin yung kanilang mga kalakasan at kainahan upang sa ganun sa mga susunod na mga bahagi ng mga activity ay mas mapalakas pa ito. Isa sa mga susi sa pag-organize ng ABI ay pakikisalamuha o pakikipagbigayan talaga ng mga ideas sa mga aming nalalaman at sharing din sa mga iba pa namin napupuntahan at ibinabalik din namin sa kanila yung aming mga natutunan.
Ang sabi ng iba, sanay na raw ang Pilipino sa mga panahon ng paghirap. Weather lang nga ba ang mabaon sa utang at mawala ng kabuhayan? Sa barangay Malabago, may magigiting na lumalaban para sa tunay na kaligtasan. Sangha, I hope that was insightful, and thank you for letting me share.
In gratitude to our teachers and for Kia offering this beautiful presentation today.